Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I think that there'll be plenty more people joining in as we proceed. But I think in the interest of time, I'd like to introduce our special guest, Joseph Martinez. I've known Joseph in a professional and personal capacity. I can tell you that out of all the CPOs that I've worked with, Joseph is by far one of the effective in the roles that he's had, especially when it comes to compliance and TPRM, which is why we were so pleased to be able to have him here today. It really is a special event for us. And so allow me to do a quick introduction of Joseph, and then I'm going to hand over to him to take us away and teach us a little bit about what he does. Now, for those of you who don't know, you can always go to Joseph's LinkedIn post, which is Joseph Martinez, all one word, with the number 1 after it. So if you just put that into LinkedIn, you'll find him there. But you can see that Joseph is an award-winning Chief Procurement Officer and has held many distinguished roles with global systemic banks. Most recently with the Bank of New York Mellon, where he spent almost 6.5 years there as their Chief Procurement Officer. In his previous roles as well at MUFG and Deutsche Bank, Joseph has held a not only important role from a sourcing strategy, Chief Procurement Officer role, but also in terms of working with all the other parties inside of the bank to ensure effective compliance. And TPRM is one critical pillar within that framework that Joseph has built time and time again. So we thought it'd be best for you to hear from the person who's been there and done that. So over to you, Joseph. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate that. And I'd like to start by thanking the Process Street team for inviting me to present with you today and have this conversation. So today we're going to cover a lot of information, and I want to ensure that we leave time for questions and answers. So as we go through the presentation, please use the Q&A chat to jot down any questions that you think as you think of them, and then we'll try and cover them in the Q&A section. And again, if we can't cover all of your questions, we'll endeavor to answer them for you offline. And as we start, one of the things that I want us to really think about is our starting point needs to be thinking about the differences between vendor management and third-party risk management, because a lot of people are using these terms interchangeably, but they're really two very different things. And so, vendor risk management, it came from the need to assess vendors and to evaluate each vendor's ability to provide goods and services to support the organization. And, that's been around for quite some time. But when you think about third-party risk management, that's expanding that scope of the program, and it's including any outside party who poses a risk to your organization. So, while VRM, it starts with a set of requirements to vet your vendors, assess them, using standard information gathering practices or questionnaires, and, documenting the expectations that you have from your vendors. It's really all about the relationship with the supplier, ensuring that you're getting the delivery of the goods or the services that you're acquiring, and understanding, that there's the significance of the supplier to your organization accordingly. However, third-party risk management has really expanded that to include mergers and acquisitions, partners, contractors, everything from professional services to staff augmentation, to federal agencies, to customers, and of course vendors, right? And so it's all about managing that risk associated with the goods and the services that you're procuring. And so I want us to kind of think about that, because you need to understand what your organization's exposure is to your suppliers, to your vendors, to your third parties and your nth parties, in order to effectively identify and measure, what the risk is associated with what's going on within your organization. So it's an evolution, but, moving to third-party risk management is more than just a name change, right? It's really more than just getting a longer list of suppliers. It's really going beyond a set of initial requirements to measure how impactful your third party is on your organization and what risk you have of doing business with this third party, so you can kind of either change that risk or accept that risk depending on what your risk appetite is. So, when we think about the effective management of a supply base, it's going to entail both vendor management as well as third-party risk management. So these concepts, are intersecting more and more over time. But, I wanted us to kind of start off with kind of thinking about that a little bit differently. If we could go to the next slide, please. So today's agenda, we're really going to cover a number of topics. I want to do kind of a recap of the U.S. Financial Interagency Guidelines. I want to talk a little bit about examining the guidance and how it can impact your third-party risk management program. We're going to go through, reviewing the requirements that organizations need to address the stages of the life cycle, and think about, implementation headlines and why your programs, and why program failures occur. And then we want to recommend a set of best practices and some principles that all organizations and all industries can kind of follow. And that's, I think, relatively important. So, if we could get to the next slide, let's get started. So when you think about, who are the regulators that are involved in this interagency guidelines? So, we got to think also not just about, today I'm talking about what's happening in the United States, but I want us to kind of think on a larger scale, because the TPRM regulations, whether it's in Brazil, India, Mexico, Singapore with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or Hong Kong with HKMA, or in the EU or other parts of the world, they also are implementing third-party oversight guidelines, and you need to follow them if you're operating in their jurisdiction. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all. You got to think about how this is in a matrix kind of fashion. But today I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with the U.S. Financial interagency guidance. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And so, actually, previous slide. So my bad. So when we think about, who are the agencies that are involved, right? You have, and as you take a look at this, you have the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Now, the board is responsible for regulating and supervising the bank holding companies, foreign banking organizations that are doing business here, that are operating in the United States. And when you think about the Federal Deposit Order, the FDIC, it provides insurance for banks and promotes sound banking practices, but it oversees state chartered banks that are not members of the Federal Reserve System and acts as a primary federal regulator for many community banks. Very important. And then, of course, we have the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, which is an independent bureau within the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and it's regulating national banks and federal savings associations, right? So the joint guidance replaces each agency's existing general guidance on TPRM, and that's been around for a while. So when you think back, the FDIC actually started this in 2008 with their guidance. Then you have in 2013 the board, and then the OCC, who then updated it with their 2020 frequently asked questions. Well, all of this, actually then was kind of creating confusion, because you may have multiple regulators based on how your institution is structured that are looking at it. So what they wanted to do is they really wanted to kind of bring that together, and so they wanted to provide a view on the sound risk management principles, for the organizations when developing and implementing their risk management practices for all stages in the life cycle for third-party relationships. That was really important. And so, if you could go to the next slide, please. So, what these agencies did was they started to go out a couple of years ago asking for people to kind of give them input. I actually was one of the ones that did provide some input to them, as well as other people that I know. And so what we did was, it was a matter of really, the agencies are trying to, kind of reiterate the guidance that they created is principles based. It's, and that's really important, because it means that the guidance is a set of foundational norms, rules, and values that provide a framework for decision making and actions, instead of giving you detailed or prescriptive rules. And that's really important, because they're not telling you how to do it. They're telling you, you're going to have to look at this within your environment, within your risk appetite, work with your board, work with your leadership teams, your CROs, et cetera. And so what they're doing is they're saying, we're going to lay down a set of principles that you have to adhere to, but we're not telling you how to actually go. So that's really important. And what it did was it kind of replaced each of the agencies' guidelines that they had. And so it really said, foundationally and importantly, they're telling us, the use of a third party does not diminish or remove your banking organization's responsibilities to ensure the activities are performed in a safe and sound manner in compliance with the applicable laws and regulations. So to that same extent, if the activities were being performed in-house, they need to be actually run the same way if you're outsourcing it. So to be clear, the organization's use of a third party is not going to remove their need for sound management. So you've got to make sure that, if they're using new technologies, or they're creating risks for your organization or your customers, you need to make sure that you're aware of that, and that you're driving forward through the guidance to make sure that you're actually managing that appropriately. And so a couple of years ago, on June the 6th of 23 is when the final guidance was issued. But however, in May of 24, the agencies released a guide specifically intended to assist community banks in developing and implementing their third-party risk management practices. So there's a slight nuance in there. Keep in mind that this guide does not substitute for the main interagency guidance. It's an augmentation to it. It's not a replacement for it. So that's really, really important. And that came out in May of 2024. So if you haven't gone, you can go to any of their sites and you can actually download a copy of it. I've done that. I would recommend that you guys do that and read that. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, the final guidance, it states that the sound third-party risk management takes into account the level of risk, complexity, and the size of the banking organization and the nature of that third-party relationship. So, the agencies underscore that the supervisory guidance does not have the force and effective law, and it does not impose any new requirements on banking organizations. It's a matter of clarifying and putting the principles in place. So, the guidance is addressing these key principles for the banks, and they're asking you to kind of develop and implement your risk management processes tailored to your own risk profile and the complexity of the third-party relationships that you guys are actually going into. So it's important to really understand that arrangement with that third party is structured so that it may assess the types and levels of risks posed and for you to kind of determine how to manage these relationships more accordingly. And there are really, kind of 4 sections that the final guidance talks about: risk management, third-party relationship, life cycle, governance, and supervisory reviews. And, we'll get into more of that, but really the risk management section is emphasizing that the bank should analyze the risks associated with their third parties within their risk appetite. And this is, really imperative to ensure that, that your organizations are operating in a safe and sound manner, and that you're actually complying with not only the regulations, but also the laws that are governing what you're doing. Now, in the life cycle of the third-party relationships, what you're really doing is you're looking at planning, due diligence, your selection, your contract negotiation, your ongoing monitoring, your termination. That's kind of the 5 life cycle components that you're doing, but it's crucial that you comprehend that this cycle is really intending for you to kind of manage the risks across that entire relationship at each of the stages, not at the end stage. What you're trying to do is look at it, when you're doing your due diligence, when you're doing, your contracting, et cetera. So it's really saying that you have to think about it from a robust governance perspective and, really establish the practices for handling how you're going to do these risks and put the right governance structures in place. They're not telling you how to do that. What they're telling you is that you need to do that. And if obviously, actually talking to some people about third-party risk management last week, and I was asking these folks who are in third-party risk management in smaller organizations, what the risk appetite is of their organization. And they couldn't tell me that. So I had to kind of walk them through why risk appetite and understanding why that is so important. In order for your program, it's kind of built around that. And if you don't have that, it's going to be hard for you to be compliant because you don't actually know what the threshold of risk is that your organization is willing to take. So the guidance is really telling us to kind of think about how to look at this, but we need to look at this in concert with how the board is setting what your risk appetite is, what your senior executives are doing, and then what you're doing from a risk organization, from a procurement organization, from a CISO's group, et cetera. So it's the guys what they're trying to do is just provide kind of a framework for you for managing this. But what they're trying to do is to say within this framework, you have the latitude to go in and make the changes that you need so you can tailor it to your organization and specifically to your organization's risk appetite. If you could go to the next slide, please. So what the agencies were doing was they were really kind of trying to clarifying and streamlining the guidance. So they're kind of removing the details that were duplicative across the 3 different organizations or regulators. They were taking out stuff that they was no longer deemed useful or could be, interpreted as prescriptive, because again, these are guidelines. These are not telling you thou shalt go and do this. They didn't come down from a mountain with some stone tablets. So, note that the activity that is critical for one organization may not be critical for another. Again, it goes back to that risk appetite. And it's really important that you guys understand that. And if I'm kind of driving that down, it's because you need to understand that not all relationships present the same level of risk, And therefore, not all relationships are going to require the same level of oversight or risk management. And so as third-party risk management professionals, you need to ensure that the risk management process that you have within your organization is aligning to your risk appetite. And how do you do that? Okay, well, you need to do that through looking at risk assessments. You conduct these thorough risk assessments for each of your relationships. You need to consider factors like the nature of the services that are provided. Do they have access to sensitive data? Do they have, what's the potential impact that they have reputationally on your organization or on their operations, right? Then you need to start thinking about it for how do you actually categorize that risk, because categorizing that third-party relationship based on their risk level, because again, not all organizations, even in the same area, are going to have the same amount of risk, because it's going to come down to what is the activity that they're doing, not just who the supplier is. So you need to think about that. And then you need to align that back to your organization's risk appetite, which means that some organizations may have a moderate risk appetite. Some of them may have a high or low, depending on what there is. And so as you're creating your portfolio, you're going to then start to kind of segment your supply base based on those, but it has to align again with what your organization's risk appetite is. And in order to align that, that means that you have to be willing to accept a level of risk that is within the parameters of your risk appetite, and have a more stringent process for anything above it. So you got to implement those controls. You've got to make sure that you're identifying these things, and that you're able to really appropriately understand what the proportionate level of risk is that you're willing to take, and then what the mitigation factors are that you have in order to do that. And then what you need to do is you need to monitor it and review it on a regular basis, because you got to ensure that the risk is being maintained within that risk appetite. And again, I sound like a broken record, but I cannot tell you that unless you actually do that, and then the regulators come in and they look at it and they're going to say, well, your program doesn't meet the standards. We're going to give you an MRA or an MIRA or, et cetera, because you guys are going to fail from an audit perspective, because your assessments are not aligned to your company's risk appetite. And your programs need to continuously, improve. They're not static. They're not meant to be a check the box exercise where we go and we do this once and we're done. So, so you got to remember that flexibility is an important part of your program, and that your program should adapt to the changes within what your organization's risk appetite might be, or what the regulatory environment might be, or what the business needs are. So you got to make sure that it's malleable. What you're doing is you're dealing with a Rubik's Cube. You're not dealing with one side of the Rubik's Cube or one box on the Rubik's Cube. So it's really important for you to think about that, because, you have to apply kind of a very sound methodology to designate which activities are going to require more of a comprehensive oversight, right? Because again, once you normalize what that portfolio looks like from a risk perspective, and at the supplier level and at the activity level, you need to make sure that you're doing that, and that you're actually performing it from that level, because it's not one size fits all, right? And so, creating and applying the effective risk management methodology is important. Risk identification is identifying those potential risks associated with each of your third-party relationships. And this could be your operational risk, your compliance risk, your reputational risk, your strategic risk. You need to be thinking about it holistically, and you can't think about it in a vacuum. If you're in third-party risk management, you need to be working with a business. You need to be working with IT. You need to be working across the organization, because the likelihood of one of these things having an impact upon you is pretty large. And if you don't look at it from a risk assessment matrix perspective, and you don't have the right scoring system in place, you're going to set yourself up for failure. So risk categorization is crucial, and you need to do this. And typically, I've seen where they're doing low, medium, and high, but I've also seen where, as certain categories are saying, well, we have nominal risk and we have critical risk, right? So you need to think about that in terms of how you're structuring it and how you're teasing that out, because you don't want to put everybody through the same process. Number one, it'll create a horrible burden for your organization. Number two, it'll create a revolt, and you don't need that, right? And so, you need to look at, how do you allocate, more, resources to and oversight to higher risk third-party relationships, which is potentially going to involve you having more frequent monitoring, or you're going to have more detailed reporting, or you're going to have more stringent controls, which means that you need to have a process that is going to be malleable enough for you to be able to do that and flexible enough for you to be able to kind of do that at an activity level. And that's not easy. I mean, I've implemented a lot of these tools and it makes it really difficult sometimes because of how rigid they are. So again, you're also going to need to continuously monitor and review the effectiveness of your risk management methodology. Okay, it's not just the program, it's the methodology that underlies the program, and make the adjustments as necessary, right? And so in order to do that, you need to have a forum, in my opinion, from a governance perspective, where you have the ability to escalate things to, and where you can actually then make those decisions. So having a good third-party risk management committee, I think, is really important, who has delegated authority coming down from the board in order for you to be able to do this. Because if you don't do this, you're going to fail. And so, again, it's going to be up to each of your individual organizations to identify your critical activities, and then using this risk-based approach that I'm talking about, you'll be able to then, appropriately put the right process in place that's going to make that as flexible for you as possible. And you need to be able to adapt to the changes that are going to happen, because they happen more regularly than you realize. If we could go to the next slide, please. So when we think about this is a shot that's coming straight out of the guidelines, and you think about the stages in the risk management life cycle, right? You have planning, due diligence, third-party selection, contract negotiation. You have your ongoing monitoring, your termination. Well, what they're telling you is we want to have a standardized, repeatable process that's qualitative and quantitative in our evaluations. They're asking you to have a consistent risk treatment. They're not asking you to rewrite the rules. What they're asking you to do is to be consistent and repeatable. Make sure that what you're doing is you're engaging the right people at the right time, not retroactively, but proactively in your program. And if you do that, what that does is it starts to really set you up for success. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we're going to start to drill down, now into kind of to examine kind of the guidance and the impact, right? And so when we think about understanding that guidance, really the first step is to thoroughly read and understand the guidance, because there's an old expression. I used to be in the Army 100 years ago, and we used to, at one point I was stationed in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And we used to say, we're from Missouri, the show me state. So you got to show me, right? So don't take it as somebody else telling you that it's right. Read it for yourself. Understand, each of the 4 sections of risk management, of the third-party life cycle and governance, of of your governance, your supervisory reviews, because that I referred to in a previous slide. Because if you do that, then what you're going to do is you're going to start to really understand. But you have to, you as an individual have to really understand what that guidance is. And you have to pay special attention to to each of these sections, and you need to be able to show how your program is actually maturing through that process. If you don't understand that, it's going to be very difficult. Which means that you're going to need to consult industry experts, right? Because if the guidance is unclear to you, you need to really kind of think about, let's talk to our legal experts, or let's talk to industry professionals who specialize in third-party risk management, because that can help you to actually gain greater insight and then mature your program much more effectively. And then it's important, like today, participate in industry forums, get into discussion groups. There are several of those on LinkedIn that I belong to, or you could, like we're attending this session today, so that what you're doing is you're interacting and you're actually working together more effectively. And so I think that leveraging these types of activities, leveraging training programs where you can, really kind of make sure that you have a broader reach across your organization. And what you need to do is you need to be able to kind of, in my opinion, create kind of a cheat sheet of the guidance, for easy reference, so that you have that. It's almost so that you have the ability to look at things more effectively and stay updated with the regulatory changes and guidance, because it's going to change over time. And you need to start looking at, what are some of the alerts that I can subscribe to? What are some of the regulatory newsletters that I can go to? But keep in mind, this is not, at the end of the day, a one-time activity. This is going to be an ongoing effort, and you need to think about that, right? You need to think about the gap analysis. You need to think about, how do I really identify and compare the practices that I have to best practice? How do I understand how my existing policies and procedures and contract terms and oversight processes are working, right? Am I evolving my contract terms? 5 years ago, you would have never had a contract term in there for agentic AI because it didn't exist. Now you need to make sure that you're looking in there and putting in the right level of protection inside your master agreements, right? So you need to think about how you're identifying these key requirements and making sure that you're introducing them into your program, but that you're not overreacting. You need to make sure that you're doing this from a balanced perspective, so that what you're doing is you're comparing the key requirements that you have to the current practices that you have, to essentially what the risk appetite is that you have as an organization. And that's critical. And you need to make sure that you're document all of the gaps that you have in a manner that's it can't be on somebody's notebook. It needs to be something that is reportable, that is auditable. You need to make sure that you're prioritizing, everything that you're doing based on the complexity of the implementation. You need to involve, the right stakeholders across your organization, because if you don't, what you're going to do is you're going to see drift. And when you see drift in your program, that then leads to an elongation of your life cycle. And, anybody who knows me knows that one of the things that I believe in is transparency. And I believe that transparency modifies all behaviors. And so you need to involve those stakeholders so that you have that transparency, that you're going in and you're validating what it is that you're doing, and that you're updating it regularly to ensure that that people understand what it is that you're doing. Then you're going to create the right action plan that's going to allow you to actually go in and update your methodologies, or update the way your contracts templates are, or improve your oversight processes, which then will allow you to implement those changes, which means that you have that cycle. If I'm going to make a change, I better communicate it. I better make sure that I'm updating it in my systems. I better make sure that I'm communicating it to my third parties internally, that I'm training my staff and members to understand that. And then, as always, it was Edward Deming 100 years ago that used to say, that which is valued is measured, that which is measured gets done, right? So if you're monitoring and you're reviewing, your program, that's going to allow you to understand, where am I within that guideline? How am I actually, doing the right level of ongoing assessments? Am I doing the periodic audits on a regular basis? And this is where you then need to involve the 3 lines of defense. The first line of defense is responsible for what's going on day to day. Your second line is your oversight, and your third line is actually kind of auditing that. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a while. But I want us to think about that, because this is how you start to prepare for when your supervisory reviews are going to come in. And therefore, if you are maintaining your detailed inventory records, of your relationships, your risk assessments, you have access to your contracts and your data. This is where using CLMs or data extraction capabilities are really important. And by really looking at all of these activities, then and document them, you can produce that very effectively, right? And so this is where process really becomes important, right? Because if you're scrambling to pull it forward because you don't have a consistent, repeatable process that a tool is giving you, it puts you in, I think, a real difficult situation. And so you also need to make sure that it's not just you who are, accurately going in and reviewing what's happening on your updated documentation, but that you're taking that for approval and for a kind of a stress test, for lack of a better term, from the different governance forms that you have, right? And so make sure that you're putting in the right level of reporting, right? I mean, because remember, speed to insight is the key to keeping your program on track and keeping your regulators at bay. I mean, it's not just about how we're doing this. The regulators are going to want to really kind of come in, and if you don't have the ability to give them the information in a timely manner, then they start to actually, become more and more prescriptive in terms of the way they're coming after you. So you need to make sure that you have a capability in a repeatable area to develop, kind of a response plan to prepare for them, right? You need to be able to train your staff to make sure that they're understanding how your program actually works, so that if they pull any one of them into a conversation, they're able to do that, right? And so, I think that that's really important for you to make sure that everybody actually understands this. In many of the organizations where I was a CPO, I actually provided the opportunity for our team members to go in and get third-party risk management certifications. I myself went through it also because I wanted to make sure whether they were in accounts payable, whether they were actually in procurement, whether they were in third-party risk management, et cetera, that they had the ability to actually understand this, get the certification in it, so that they're able to actually have clear and concise expectations as to how our programs are going to work. And then by ultimately, ensuring that we're able to do this, our programs were robust enough and effective enough to make sure that we were able to either close existing regulatory issues or make sure that new ones didn't crop up. So, we need to think about that. Next slide, please. So if you could go to the next slide, yep. So really what we're doing is when we're reviewing the life cycle here, we're wanting to make sure that you're training, you understand that people understand the risk, you're making sure that, that everybody's thinking about this, but then you need to start thinking about it from the planning component, right? And evaluating, considering, what goes into those relationships. How are we actually, supporting this? If we have a higher level of risk or critical activity, how are we identifying it, teasing it out? How are we then going to the board to make sure that they're actually okay with what we're trying to do? Because there are a lot of factors that we need to think about as we go through this. And as we kind of enter into the planning phase, and again, I'm kind of repeating everything that you saw in that little triangle. And in a sense, it's really about, what is the purpose for that arrangement? What are the associated risks and costs? And, are there information security or physical security implementations? Do we have resilience and contingency planning that we're taking into consideration? All of that needs to be, again, part of your methodology. And you need to make sure that you're evaluating whether you can appropriately identify and monitor your risk controls, right? And the scope of the and degree of due diligence that should be, consummate with the risk associated with that third-party relationship. And that what you're doing is that you're looking at your external factors, and that in some instances it's okay to use consultants or even consortiums to supplement, the information gathering that you're doing. But you need to make sure that you're looking at this in such a manner that you're looking at it to mitigate the risks, not just to, it's not, again, I keep saying this, but I've come into organizations where they were at a check the box exercise and we had to blow things up and start over. That's what I'm telling you. You got to think about how you're doing this, and you need to consider also when you're doing your due diligence and your selection, how is this tied to the strategy and the goals of your organization, and how are you looking at those third parties and understanding, what their financial conditions are, what are their resources, experience, and capabilities, how do they actually follow, the right requirements from a IT perspective, So again, the regulators state that where we are collaborative efforts to reduce, the burden of due diligence, we do not abrogate the responsibility for our organizations to manage those relationships in a safe and a sound manner. They always say that, and again, that's why it's a guidance and a guideline, right? So you need to make sure that what we're doing is really addressing these challenges, and there is a heck of a challenge in collecting information, especially if you have multiple systems. One of the biggest issues that I've seen in trying to put these together is that you don't have a consistent taxonomy, and so you end up with things that are slightly different. So when it comes time to reporting, it's very difficult for you to be able to report accurately because you don't have the right taxonomy, right? And so you need to make sure that you're clarifying and that you're focused on what your processes are and what the processes are within your third parties to kind of manage this. And this starts with really kind of even at the contract negotiation level. Obviously you're doing it in the due diligence part also, but when you're contracting, you need to tailor the level of comprehensiveness to your contract provisions based on the risk and complexity that the partner is representing you. So you're looking at it at the category level, then you're looking at it at the activity level, but you're also looking at it at who the partner is so that you can actually put the right level of controls in place. And again, you can't do this in a manual manner. This is not a spreadsheet thing. You have to actually have a process that's consistent, that's repeatable, that's easy to use, and that actually can be used from an orchestration perspective across what you're doing. And so you need to think about all of this as you're considering it and you're looking at what you're doing, right? When you look at what you're going to do from an ongoing monitoring, you need to confirm the capability of the third-party controls, and then you need to have an escalation path, if issues or concerns arise, and you need to have a way to respond to them, not in an ad hoc manner, but in a consistent, repeatable manner, right? And so you also need to make sure that what you're doing is you're really focusing more frequently on your higher risk activities and your critical activities. Those are the ones that you're going to have to monitor in shorter cycle times. You're going to need to make sure that you're monitoring them with the right level of specificity in order to maybe make sure that what you're doing is not, again, not a check the box exercise, but that you're factoring into it, what it is that you're trying to do in order to make sure that you're doing this. And this goes all the way through to when you end up, deciding that you need either come to the natural end of a relationship, or you need to terminate it. And so in that termination phase, you need to think about, what are my transition plans? What are my time frames? What are the data related risks that I have if there's been data that's been shared with your third party? What are we doing from a joint intellectual property perspective, right? What are the potential impacts to our customers if we make a change in these areas? So we got to be thinking about these things, and if we don't do that, it makes it really difficult for us to be effective, right? So, I just think that it's really important for us to really think about, how are we involving and dispersing our responsibilities across the three lines of defense, and how are we, centralizing where we can under specific functions like compliance, like information security, like procurement, like risk management, so that what we're doing is we're creating a federated model that allows us to allow subject matter experts to actually own and control what they're doing within a broader framework. Okay, and so regardless of what structure you choose, there are going to be certain governance practices that you've got to take into account across your program, and it needs to be consistent, and it needs to be driven by your board and by your executive management. Otherwise, it's going to fail. And so we need to think about that, all of that oversight and all of that accountability for what we're trying to do, and how are we addressing this in our compliance systems. How are we looking at this from a complexity perspective? How are we looking at this in terms of putting in place the right activities that are going to tease out the right information so that we can align to the strategic goals that we have. Make sure, again, this is all tied back to our risk appetite, and make sure that what we're doing is actually resulting in remediation and in business enhancement, because all of this is going to impact your cost to income ratio if you're and the life cycle time that it takes for you to onboard a supplier or to continue to work with them if you're misaligned. Okay, and so you've got to really make sure that what you're doing is really driving all of that. So we got to think about what are the factors and who do we think about. And so again, ultimately this responsibility is being driven from the board level. Okay, and so you got to make sure that you have that consistent interface where you're regularly reporting back up into the board. And then this is where they should be thinking about providing you with high level guidance, not prescriptive, but high level guidance on how to kind of put your program in place. And they need to be actually doing kind of a challenger scenario where you're doing this. But this is really they're looking at it from an independent view, because most of these folks are not from your organization. And what they're wanting to do is to really kind of think about, how are you actually aligning to what they've told you to do? And then does it really create is there a conflict there, right? And one of the things you got to do is you got to look at the factors in terms of what's happening inside these reviews, right? You want to make sure that you're measuring and you're monitoring your control of your third parties and their engagements, but you also want to kind of take a look at their staffs, and you want to look for things like conflicts of interest, right? And call those out, because if you have a sound program, it's going to tease that out, and you're going to be able to report that, and that's going to, I think, give you, a capability that you're thinking about. And so, again, as you go through this, and you're developing this, there's a lot of outside, why reinvent the wheel, right? So if you're looking at risk assessments or you're looking at due diligence capabilities, there are third-party capabilities and services that you can use to help help your program do this. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to provide that in a very transparent manner back to your board, so that there's an independent review in terms of what it is that you're trying to do. And it's important because what's going to happen is when the supervisors from the regulators come in, they're going to really look at your activities, and then they're going to start to measure you based on the lens as to the complexity of the program that you put in place. And they're either going to find it maybe too prescriptive, that rarely happens, just right, or they're going to say you need to improve X, Y, and Z. And so, if we could go to the next slide, please. So let's start thinking about some of the implementation things that we've got to do. And, what I did was I wanted to get some information that was broader. And so I looked at a couple of different sources for this. And so in the notes, I call it out. Some of this is coming from the headlines that are out in the market. And some of these are actually coming from places like the E&Y TPRM 24-25 survey, right? Because we wanted to understand, and give you some reasons why things fail and then what you can do to actually fix them, right? And so when you look at the effective TPRM performance is low, 60% of companies fail and 75% are struggling. That's crazy. If you were in school, 60% is an F, 75% is a C minus, it's probably a D. I mean, and so if our programs are not really happening because of that, we got to look at that. And why is it? It's because they're under resourced, right? People, funds, priorities. 66% have struggled with resources, with only 40% of the vendors being reviewed. So that's telling you that there's still 60% of the vendors that they haven't touched. And again, you got to look at it through that risk lens, right? Executive sponsorship and engagement. 65% of organizations fail to get the necessary sponsorship and support. Again, it comes from tone from the top. If it's not set at the board and at the C-suite level, it won't permeate down. And so it's going to create failure. Poor communication, coordination, and integration. So when you think 45% struggled with internal silos, 55% struggled with cross-company integration. Well, think about that, okay? When people are creating fiefdoms and they believe that their fiefdom is really all that matters, that's what creates, I think, a lot of the issues that we start to see. And so we need to think about that. And when we think about, the compliance involvement has more than doubled, well, that's telling you that the regulators are starting to really look at this. Your auditors are starting to look at this. So it's really important. And when we think about, cybersecurity, that's being tracked as, the top risk. 85% of companies say that it's their highest concern. When you're thinking of business continuity, that's an emerging area. It's growing. When we take a look at the poor tools visibility as root cause correction, right? So 61% are unable to assess the risks across their vendor lifecycle. 41% rely on spreadsheets and manual tracking. Again, spreadsheets are not going to cut it for you. And 65% have poor quality of the root cause correlation. It's because they're not looking at it systemically. They're looking at it tactically, right? And so meeting board and C-suite information needs proactive management on TPRM. Again, 40% of the companies fail to meet these expectations because if you look at the previous 8 things, that's what's driving that, right? And so we got to think about how we're doing this. But really, understanding the true cost of failure, 60% of the companies are providing directional impact and few at the actual total cost, revenue or profit loss, plus operational cost recovery, plus contract penalties, plus legal and regulatory fines, et cetera, et cetera. All of this is driving what that true cost looks like. And so it's really important for us to kind of think about that, okay? And if we could go to the next slide, hopefully we can start to build on this. So, what are some of the recommended best practices that I think you guys need to start thinking about, right? And I think when you think about that, having clear policies and procedures, are important, right? Because you got to develop comprehensive policies and procedures that outline your organization's approach to third-party risk management. If you write it down and you're able to measure it, then you're going to do it, right? And so I think that, you need to think about, as you're creating your policies and procedures, you need to make sure that you have a clearly defined scope of the policy, including which third-party relationships it's going to be applicable to. You need to identify who is responsible for managing these risks within your organizations. That is really important because it can't be nebulous, because then nobody will do it. You need to describe the process for assessing your third-party risks, including how risks are identified, assessed, and mitigated. Goes back to your methodology. That should be fairly straightforward. And you need to specify what your due diligence requirements are for your third parties, including what information should be collected at what part of the life cycle, who should be evaluated, and why you're doing this, right? And so when you look at the contracts, right, you really need to think about the detail the contract requirements for your third parties. You need to make sure that the terms and conditions are relative, because there's a term out there called value at risk. And you can't determine value at risk if you don't actually have the right contractual terms put into your contracts, right? And so you need to also describe how your third-party relationships are going to be monitored to ensure compliance back to your contractual obligations, because then that's what creates that delta, which really drives performance standards and then creates that value at risk that I'm talking about. So all of this is really important for us to really think about, how we actually are looking at this, and this needs to be done on a regular basis. You need to actually think about how you're going to have a true centralized repository of all your information for your third parties that's easily accessible to. Okay, you need to be able to make sure that you have the right types of information on the services, on the contract terms, on the metrics, on the risk assessment results or whatever, that you're collecting all of that, you're centralizing it, and you're able to report on it very regularly, right? You need to be able to ensure that you're looking at how your changes are happening within that organization and within your existing vendors, right? And make sure that you're categorizing your vendors on the criticality of their services. That's really important, right? Because it's the service that's driving. Because you may have a supplier that is doing multiple services to you. Some of them may not be, some may be moderate, some may be high, some may be critical. So you got to look at it through the lens of the criticality of their services, not just them as a supplier, right? And so that means that when you start to implement your onboarding processes, you need to have a standard process, right? So that you're able to make sure that you're looking consistently at your vendor portfolio. And this process should include, adding the new vendor to the inventory and collecting all the necessary information. And the more automated that you can do that, the better off you are from a process perspective, right? So therefore, think about the technology solutions, such as third-party risk management software or, process software that you can use to streamline the maintenance of your portfolio, and, and make sure that you are assigning and holding accountable your individuals for their portion of the portfolio. You got to look at it in aggregate, but then you're going to say this portion is assigned to you. And again, it goes back to the three lines of defense, right? So you got to remember that having that up-to-date vendor inventory is critical if you're going to be successful. And a lot of companies today say that they have it, but they don't, once you start to kind of scratch beneath the surface, right? And so it's important for you to conduct, that risk assessment by segment, right? And again, how are you gonna identify the potential risks associated with each of your relationships? How are you going to assess the likelihood of the impact once you've identified that, right? How are you going to then document that, those findings of that risk, and how are you going to put it in such a structured manner that you can then get it to the right governance forum that you need to do. And then based on that, you then need to develop the mitigation strategies and put the appropriate level of effort so that you're actually then making the revisions, whether it's to the contract or to the oversight process, or you're going to implement additional controls, or you need to make some strategic suppliers as to whether you're going to exit the relationship. But all of this needs to be structured. It can't be ad hoc, okay? And so you need to make sure that you're identifying on the front end who your relevant stakeholders are and what their process is going to be within this, and then you need to hold them accountable. And a lot of people are okay at the front end of wanting to do this, but as soon as you start to hold them accountable, they start to not want to do this. So it's really important for us to make sure that we're doing this, because I think it's a critical component of any effective third-party risk management program to make sure that you're getting these regular risk assessments and that you're holding the people accountable for actually doing what they say they're going to do. And so, it's important for us to think about how we're, going through all of this. What are the steps that we're doing to really understand? What are we doing to gather? What are we doing to to ensure that we're evaluating what we're doing, and then how are we actually managing that, and who is managing that within your organization. So I know, I'm just trying to kind of telling you it's important to make sure that you have the right metrics, the right responsibilities, make sure that you're setting the right performance. And I know that we're starting to kind of run out of time a little bit, but I can't overemphasize to you that, having the right level of information, converting it to intelligence is really what's going to drive this for you. And if you do that, you're going to have a really capable. Do we have any questions that we may want to get to?
Yeah, we do, Joseph. We've got one question from Vincent. He's saying, regarding ongoing monitoring, he realizes that the interagency guidance requires this, but do you have any specific suggestions on effective monitoring practices that would satisfy the regulatory expectations?
Well, I think a lot of that monitoring is going to happen based on how you actually structure your program, right? And what's going to happen is, what is the right governance structure that you put in place, and on the front end, based on setting in place what your risk appetite is, and then segmenting your suppliers to that point. That's really what's going to drive the outcome for what you're trying to do, right? And if you're doing that, then I think you'll be able to kind of tease out from a tiering perspective what the monitoring is that they want, what the reporting is that they need to do. And I've seen this at a number of different banks that I've worked at, where we set up the program, where what we were trying to do is we were trying to just, in essence, figure out what the right structure was at the right risk level for us to be able to ensure that we were able to generate the information in an appropriate level, and more importantly, allow the regulators to come in and find that information on their own by giving them access. And you can't do that unless you're maintaining that comprehensive inventory, unless you're actually having the right level of assessment, unless you make sure that you have the right information in terms of whether you're using a SIG questionnaire or something else. I think that's all like really, really important if you're going to do this, because again, an over reliance on checklists is going to really, I think, lead to a box ticking exercise, rather than actually focusing on where the true risk is, in my opinion.
Okay, that's great. So you talked about getting stakeholders engaged in the process and making sure that they have accountability, so that this is not just being driven by one function, but it's an enterprise-wide program. When it comes to monitoring, do you also hold them accountable for monitoring, or is that something that you would sort of keep as your responsibility versus pushing that to the business?
Well, I think monitoring continuously is really kind of it's a team sport, right? So there's going to be certain sub-segments across that life cycle that are going to be, you're going to have a very formalized part probably within third-party risk management, but within that you may have the subject matter experts that I talked about. So folks out of your CISO organization are probably going to be responsible for some of that monitoring that's going to come out of your information security standards, right? Or so again, it's not one group that's going to do it. I think it's going to be sub-segmented according to what that portion of the risk is and who the subject matter expertise is. And what you're doing is you're trying to create an orchestration capability that goes across the portfolio, so that you're able to be much more effective in terms of what you're doing. I hope
that's really great. I think we've got, that's a great answer. Thank you. Are there any other questions before we wrap up from everybody in the 3 minutes or so remaining?
Well, one of the things that I'd like to kind of drive is that I think it's really important that you guys think about from a vendor risk management perspective, how automated workflows are going to streamline your onboarding, your due diligence, your ongoing monitoring. All of this cannot be done with spreadsheets, and you can't be audit ready if you don't have the documentation that is up to date and easily accessible, right? So So for me, making audits more efficient and less disruptive comes down to making sure that you have the right capability and the right accountability so you can scale, and to do that, you need to use your automated systems that have, clear audit trails, accountability. You're able to actually track issues, escalate promptly, and you can't do that offline. That just doesn't work. I mean, we tried doing that, years ago. So, what you need to do is if you're going to do your continuous monitoring, you need to implement real-time risk tracking and regular assessment, right? If you're going to be looking at the integration with your business strategy, you need to align your compliance goals with your organizational objectives. You can't do that offline. You've got to find some way in order to do that appropriately. And if you can't do that, I think I guess what I'm trying to say is you need a culture of accountability. And
Yeah.
in order to have that culture of accountability, you need to have easy access to that information so that you can have that shared responsibility for the compliance across all departments. This is not an individual sport. It's a team sport.
It's fantastic, Joseph. Thank you. Very powerful. We have a question from Drew. Yes, Drew.
Actually, not quite a question, but I put in the chat for folks. I've got 30 years with Accenture and 40 years of transformation experience using technology and digital enabled AI tools most recently. In playing with Process Street, using Process Street, it's the most comprehensive I've seen, taking a policy and driving it down into a discrete process, both inside your company and across your company, with proactive accountabilities that drive the behavior you're looking for versus follow-up phone calls and personal interactions. So there's a lot of automation built in and a lot of capability from a dashboard reporting, both transparency all the way up to the board and also for the auditors. So just a public service announcement there.
That's wonderful, Drew. Thank you for that. It's always nice to hear those compliments from happy customers. Thanks so much. And thank you so much to Joseph for this presentation. Joseph, I've learned a lot and I've been around this space for quite a long time. So thank you for taking us through that. Your slides are fantastic, real comprehensive guide there. We'll share them with everybody on the call along with a recording. So again, I wish to thank everybody for attending and I wish you all a great day ahead.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.